I had not cycled the airlock in over 24 hours. Not because the seals were failing. I checked the gaskets myself, running a bead of silicone along the hairline cracks in the rubber 3 days ago. But because the pressure differential on the other side did not feel right. I could feel it in my ears, a heavy, static weight pressing against the steel plating of the blast door. I was holed up in a switchgear room off the maintenance spur of the Chicago Red Line, about 80 feet below street level. It was not a home. It was a 10 by 10 concrete box filled with high-voltage breakers and the smell of ozone and stale sweat. I had secured the entry with a heavy steel workbench I'd dragged across the floor, greasing the legs with WD-40 first so the screech of metal on concrete would not echo down the tunnel. I braced it against the handle with a hydraulic jack extended to its limit, creating a localized pressure point that no amount of pounding from the outside could dislodge. The only light came from the LEDs on my battery bank, glowing a soft, rhythmic green. I watched them blink. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Repeat. It was the only order left in a world that had dissolved into chaos. I checked my watch. 0300 hours. The city above would be silent, or as silent as it ever got. The things that roamed the tunnels, the shufflers, the brain rot cases, whatever you wanted to call them, they went dormant in the deep cold of the early morning.
Their metabolism slowed down. They clustered near the steam pipes, conserving heat, waiting for a vibration to trigger their aggression response. It was time to move. My water filtration setup was failing. I'd been pulling groundwater from a weeping fracture in the tunnel wall, running it through a layered filter of charcoal, sand, and a torn-up N95 mask stuffed into a cut plastic bottle. But the last batch had come out cloudy, tasting of iron and sulfur. The charcoal was spent. I needed fresh activated carbon, or better yet, sealed bottles. And I knew where to find them. I packed my kit with the muscle memory of a man who had done this 100 times. Fluke multimeter, insulated screwdrivers, Knipex pliers, a small pry bar, and my framing hammer, a 22-ounce Estwing with a leather grip that had molded to my hand over the last month. I laced my boots tight, double-knotting the laces and tucking the loops inside the tongue to prevent snagging. Loose gear got you killed. Noise got you killed. I released the hydraulic pressure on the jack slowly. The hiss of the escaping air was barely a whisper. I slid the workbench back just enough to create a gap, my movements calculated and fluid. The air from the tunnel hit me instantly, cold, damp, carrying the scent of moldy trash and standing water. I slipped out into the corridor, pressing my back against the cable runs mounted to the wall. The tunnel was a throat of darkness.
I did not use my flashlight yet. I let my eyes adjust, listening to the acoustic signature of the space. Drips. The groan of settling earth. The wind howling through a broken grate miles away. But no footsteps. No wet, slapping sounds of bare feet on concrete. I moved south, walking on the balls of my feet, rolling the weight to the outside edge of the sole to dampen the impact. I stepped over the third rail, treating it with respect even though the grid had been dead for weeks. Old habits. The destination was a traction power substation 3 blocks down. It had a break room with a vending machine I had not looted yet. But more importantly, it had a first aid station with chemical ice packs. Ammonium nitrate. If I could harvest enough of it, I could make a cold compress for the swelling in my knee, or if things got desperate, refine it into something more volatile. I reached the substation access door. It was locked, a heavy magnetic seal that had failed in the closed position. Most people would have tried to bash it down. I pulled out my pry bar and the multimeter. I jammed the flat end of the bar into the gap between the frame and the door, not to force it, but to create leverage on the strike plate. Then I used the screwdriver to short the solenoid contacts exposed in the cracked panel box. A sharp spark, a smell of burning copper, and the internal locking mechanism disengaged with a dull, heavy thud inside the door. I eased it open.
The break room was tossed. Chairs overturned. Coffee grounds scattered like black sand across the linoleum. But the vending machine was there. The glass front was intact. I did not break it. Breaking glass is a dinner bell. Instead, I used the tubular lockpick I'd scavenged from a janitor's keyring in the first week. I worked the tool into the cylinder, feeling for the shear line of the pins. Tension, rotation, click. Tension, rotation, click. The lock turned. The front panel swung open silently. I loaded my pack with everything that had a seal. Peanuts, energy bars, a few bags of chips that I pricked with a pin to deflate so they would not crinkle in my bag. I was reaching for the last row when I heard it. A scrape. It was not the wind. It was the specific, granular sound of grit being crushed under a heel. I froze, my hand still inside the machine. The sound came from the tunnel I had just left. I killed the small penlight I was holding. Darkness rushed back in, heavy and absolute. Another sound. A wet exhalation, like air escaping a punctured lung. They were tracking me, not visually, but by scent or heat. I lowered the machine panel slowly, guiding it back into the latch without letting it snap. I did not lock it. I drew the hammer. I crept to the doorway and peered out. Through the gloom, I saw the pale, twitching shapes. 3 of them. They were huddled near a puddle I'd stepped through, heads low, sniffing the water. They looked like unfinished clay sculptures, human features blurred by the infection, skin gray and sloughing off in patches. I could not go back the way I came. I scanned the room. There was a rear maintenance exit, a heavy fire door labeled Emergency Egress, Do Not Block. I moved to it, testing the push bar. It was rusted stiff. If I shoved it, the hinges would scream. I looked at the floor. A bottle of industrial floor wax lay on its side, leaking a slow, viscous puddle. I scooped a glob of the wax onto my gloved finger and smeared it heavily over the top and bottom hinges of the fire door, working it into the joints. I waited 10 seconds for it to penetrate, then applied steady, increasing pressure to the bar. The metal groaned, a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth more than I heard. But it opened. I slipped through and let it close behind me, catching the edge with my boot to prevent the latch from slamming. I was in the older tunnels now, the Chicago Tunnel Company system. Narrower, brick-lined, built for freight carts in the early 1900s. The air here was different, drier, carrying the dust of a century. I moved faster now, limp running, favoring my left leg. My knee was throbbing, a deep, structural ache that warned of ligament damage. I needed to find a place to hole up, somewhere with a defensible choke point. The tunnel floor was uneven, buckled by years of neglect. I rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. The wall to my left was gone. It was not a collapse. It was a breach. Something explosive had torn through the brickwork, exposing a cavernous space beyond. But it was not natural rock. Through the jagged hole, I saw smooth, seamless concrete, an architectural style that did not match the subway or the freight tunnels. This was military-grade construction. A red strobe light pulsed from deep within the breach. 1 second on, 3 seconds off. I checked my rear. The shuffling sounds were getting louder, echoing off the brick.
They had found the fire door. I did not have a choice. I scrambled up the pile of debris, the loose bricks shifting under my boots, and slid down the other side into the anomaly. I landed hard on a steel grating. The impact jarred my spine, and my flashlight flickered out. I smacked the casing, percussive maintenance, and the beam flared back to life. I was standing on a catwalk overlooking a massive vertical shaft. Below me, the darkness was absolute. Above, thick bundles of conduit and piping ran along the ceiling, labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to a civilian engineer. Sec D4, priority line, do not cut. The red light was coming from a control panel next to a blast door 10 yards ahead. The door was massive, a slab of steel and lead designed to withstand a megaton impact. And it was slightly ajar.
I moved toward it, my hammer raised. The gap was just wide enough for a person. I squeezed through, scraping my backpack on the frame. Inside, the air was dead. Not stale, but motionless. It smelled of ozone and high-grade lubricants. I was in a decontamination vestibule. Stainless steel showers, grates in the floor, nozzles aimed from every angle. I needed to secure this door. If those things followed me through the breach, this was my only barrier. I shone my light on the locking mechanism. It was a manual wheel connected to a planetary gear system. I grabbed the wheel and pulled. It did not budge. The grease in the gears had likely solidified over decades of disuse. I dropped my pack and pulled out a canister of penetrating oil and my adjustable wrench. I soaked the central spindle, the smell of the solvent sharp and chemical in the clean air. I fitted the wrench to the nut securing the wheel and tapped the handle with my hammer. Clack, clack. The vibration broke the seal of rust. I removed the wrench, grabbed the wheel with both hands, and heaved. It turned. A high-pitched squeal of metal on metal pierced the silence, painful and loud. I gritted my teeth and kept turning. The massive door began to slide, the heavy steel rollers rumbling in their tracks like a distant train. I watched the gap narrow. 6 inches. 4. 2. Thump. A hand, gray, wet, and missing fingernails, slapped through the remaining opening, grabbing the edge of the doorframe. I did not scream. I did not panic. I stepped forward, swung the hammer in a tight, controlled arc, and brought the claw down on the wrist. There was a crunch of bone, wet and sickening. The hand recoiled instantly. I threw my weight into the wheel for the final rotation. The door slammed home. I spun the locking bars until they engaged, the internal bolts sliding into the frame with a deep, resonant clunk that felt like a vault sealing shut. I stood there, chest heaving, listening. From the other side, a dull thudding began. Fists hitting 4 inches of hardened steel. It sounded distant, irrelevant. They were not getting in. I was safe. For now. I turned to face the room. The decontamination chamber was sterile, white tiles and chrome fixtures. On the far wall, a row of hazmat suits hung in plastic bags, yellow and brittle with age. Beside them, a bench. I sat down, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving behind the cold ache of exhaustion. I took a drink of water from my bottle, swirling it in my mouth to catch the grit before swallowing. I looked at the console on the wall. It was dead, but the analog pressure gauge next to it showed a reading. The needle was hovering just above 0. Positive pressure. That meant the air handling system was still active, somewhere deep below. It meant power. It meant filters. I pulled out my notebook and a pencil. I wrote down the date,
then the time, and then I wrote, Sector D4, breach secured, power active, moving to investigate systems. I was not just a survivor anymore. I was a technician in a facility that needed fixing. And I had my tools. The silence in the decontamination chamber was not empty. It was pressurized. It pressed against my eardrums with the weight of millions of tons of concrete and earth above my head. I sat on the bench for another 5 minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the beam of my flashlight, regulating my breathing. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. Panic was a metabolic fire. It burned calories I could not replace and clouded the judgment I needed to survive. Once my heart rate dropped below 100, I stood up. The immediate threat was behind a foot of steel. Now I had to face the long-term threats: dehydration, hypothermia, and asphyxiation. I picked up my pack. It felt heavier now, the straps digging into the bruised muscle of my shoulders. I approached the inner door of the airlock. It was a standard naval-style bulkhead, lighter than the blast door but still substantial. The seal was hermetic. I spun the wheel, listening to the dogs retract. They moved smoothly, well greased. Someone had maintained this place right up until the end. I stepped through into the facility proper. The transition was physical.
The air here was bone dry and significantly colder, stripping the moisture from my eyes instantly. It smelled of preserved stagnation, vinyl floor wax, recycled air, and the faint copper tang of overheated electronics. I was in a corridor, wide enough for a forklift. The walls were painted a two-tone institutional scheme, cream on top, industrial gray on the bottom, separated by a red stripe at waist height. Emergency lighting strips ran along the floorboards, casting long, amber shadows that stretched away into the darkness. I checked the nearest wall panel. Level 3, Support and Engineering. Good. I did not need administrative offices or barracks yet. I needed the lungs and the heart of this beast. I moved down the hall, my boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum. The acoustic dampening in here was incredible. The sound of my own footsteps died instantly, absorbed by acoustic tiles that lined the ceiling. It felt like walking inside a recording booth. The first door on the right was labeled Electrical Distribution Local. I tried the handle. Locked. I did not waste time picking it. I kept moving. I needed the source, not the branches. At the end of the corridor, the hallway opened up into a mezzanine overlooking a cavernous room. I walked to the railing and shone my light down. It was the generator bay. Even from 20 feet up, the scale of the machinery was humbling.
2 massive diesel generators sat on concrete pads, painted a high-visibility yellow that had dulled with dust. They were the size of locomotives. V16 engines mated to alternators big enough to power a small town. The room was silent. No hum of transformers, no vibration in the floor, just the dead weight of cold iron. I scanned the room with my light. Catwalks laced the upper levels. Large conduit pipes, labeled in color-coded bands, fed into the walls. On the far side, a glass-walled control booth overlooked the floor. I took the stairs down, gripping the cold rail. My knee protested with every step, a sharp spike of pain under the kneecap, but the brace held. I reached the floor level and approached the nearest generator. It was an EMD unit, likely a 645 series, a 2-stroke workhorse. I placed my gloved hand on the engine block. It was freezing, leaching the heat right out of my palm. This machine had not run in weeks, maybe months. I walked around to the front of the unit, checking the gauge cluster mounted near the governor. Oil pressure, 0. Water temperature, ambient. RPM, 0. But the ready-to-start indicator was dark. I needed to understand why the system was dead. I climbed the short metal ladder to the control booth. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was warmer, the heat trapped by the glass. A bank of analog dials and a single CRT monitor dominated the console. The monitor was dead.
I checked the battery voltage gauge for the facility's DC control bus. The needle was hovering in the red zone, just above 22 volts. The emergency batteries were dying. When they hit 20, the solenoids would likely disengage, and the whole facility would go black. I had hours, maybe less. I found the main logbook on the desk. It was open. The last entry was scrawled in blue ballpoint pen, the handwriting jagged, indicating stress or fatigue. Day 42. Fuel intake valve erratic. Main pumps shut down to preserve reserve tank integrity. Auto start sequence disabled to prevent dry cycling. Running on battery bank B until intake cleared. If you're reading this, do not try to pull from the main line without flushing the sediment trap first. There was no signature. I looked through the glass at the silent yellow giants. They were paperweights without fuel. And the system had been deliberately crippled to save them from destroying themselves. I had to be the mechanic. I left the booth and went back down to the floor. I dropped my pack and pulled out my tools. First, the fuel. The fuel lines ran from the ceiling into a filtration skid before hitting the engines. I followed the piping to a manual valve assembly near the wall. The tag read, "Primary Day Tank Feed." I pulled a rag from my pocket and wiped the dust off the sight glass on the filter housing. It was dark, almost black. Sediment. If I opened the valve now, I'd push sludge into the injectors, clogging the nozzles instantly. The engine would starve and die, and I'd never get it clean without a workshop. I located the drain cock at the bottom of the filter housing. I needed a container. I found a plastic waste bin near the control booth stairs and kicked it over, dragging it under the valve. I used my adjustable wrench to crack the nut. It was stiff, painted over. I applied steady pressure, feeling the friction give way. A thick, dark sludge oozed out, smelling of tar and old varnish. I let it run. It moved slowly, like molasses. I watched the flow, waiting for the color to change. Minutes ticked by. The silence of the room made the slow drip of the sludge sound like a rhythmic tapping. Finally, the viscosity changed. The sludge thinned out, turning into a clear, amber stream of red-dyed off-road diesel. Clean fuel. I tightened the drain cock and wiped my gloves. Step 1 complete. Now, the priming. I moved to the engine itself. These big diesels did not use electric sparks. They used compression. But to get that compression, you had to turn the engine over fast enough to ignite the fuel. That required a starter. And on an engine this size, the starter was not a small electric motor. It was a pneumatic turbine powered by compressed air. I checked the air receiver tanks standing vertically against the back wall. They were huge, rated for 500 psi. The gauge on the primary tank read 150. Marginal. It was barely enough for 1, maybe 2 start attempts. If I messed it up, I'd be hand-pumping air for a week, or the facility would die before I finished. I traced the air line to the starter motor on the side of the engine block. There was a solenoid valve that controlled the air burst. It was wired to the automated system upstairs, the system that was currently dead. I had to bypass the computer. I had to manually trigger the air dump. I pulled out my multimeter and checked the solenoid terminals. No voltage. The control signal was cut. I could try to hotwire it with a battery, but the voltage mismatch might fry the coil. The manual override.
Most industrial solenoids had a mechanical pin for testing. I shone my flashlight into the recess of the valve body. There it was, a small, recessed brass pin. Pushing that in would mechanically open the valve and dump the compressed air into the starter turbine. But I could not be in two places at once. I needed to hold the fuel rack open while triggering the air. The fuel rack lever was on the governor, 5 feet away. I looked around for scrap. I found a length of stiff wire cable near the maintenance bench. I stripped the insulation off the ends. I looped one end around the fuel rack lever and pulled it taut, tying it off to a conduit pipe so the rack was locked in the full fuel position.
I checked the oil level on the massive dipstick one last time. It was low, but readable. Thick, black, cold. It would have to do. I positioned myself at the starter solenoid. I took the handle of my screwdriver and aligned it with the brass pin. This was it. The cold start. The room felt tighter. The air felt thinner. I was about to wake a sleeping dragon in a sealed cave. I braced my feet against the concrete pad. I took a deep breath, tasting the stale dust. I shoved the screwdriver handle into the pin. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A scream of escaping air tore through the room, a high-pitched shriek that vibrated in my molars. The starter turbine spun up with the sound of a jet engine engaging. The massive flywheel began to turn. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. The pistons fought the cold oil. The engine groaned, a deep, tectonic grinding sound of metal waking up. The floor beneath my boots began to shudder. I watched the flywheel. It was turning, but slowly. The air pressure was dropping. I could hear the pitch of the turbine falling. "Come on," I whispered. The sound of my voice was lost in the mechanical chaos. Whoomp chug, whoomp chug. The compression was building. I could smell unburnt diesel mist spraying from the exhaust manifold where a gasket had failed. The white fog began to fill the space around the engine. Then, the ignition. It did not start like a car. It started like an artillery barrage. Boom! A cylinder fired. The engine bucked on its dampeners. Boom, boom. 2 more caught. The rhythm shifted from a laboring grind to a staggered, violent hammering. Boom, boom, chug, roar. The remaining cylinders caught fire. The engine roared to life, a deafening, chest-compressing thunder that washed away the silence of the last month. Black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack, hitting the ceiling vents before the fans kicked in. I scrambled back, pulling the wire to release the fuel rack from full before the engine ran away and tore itself apart. The governor fought for control, the RPMs flaring up and then settling down into a steady, heavy rhythm. Thrum, 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 thrum. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of power. It was the sound of civilization. I leaned against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline dump leaving me weak. I watched the gauges on the engine block. Oil pressure rose. 30 psi. 40. Steady. Water temperature began to climb off the peg. The lights in the room flickered. The emergency ambers died, and for a terrifying second, there was total darkness. Then, with a heavy, magnetic clunk of the main transfer switch engaging, the overhead high bay lights slammed on. White, brilliant, blinding light flooded the room. It was harsh and clinical, exposing every layer of dust, every oil stain, every rust spot. It hurt my eyes. I squinted.
shielding my face, laughing a dry, cracking laugh that I could not stop. The fans in the ceiling spooled up, a low drone that joined the chorus. The smoke began to clear, sucked away into the ventilation shafts. I stood up, using the wall for support. The facility was awake. I walked back up the stairs to the control booth. The difference was night and day. The CRT monitor was humming, lines of code scrolling down the screen in green phosphor. System reboot initiated. Power source, generator 1. Bus voltage, 480 volts, stable. Battery charging. I sat in the operator's chair. It was comfortable, expensive ergonomic mesh that had survived the apocalypse. I spun it around to face the board. I had power. I had light. Now I needed to know what else I had. I navigated the menu using the arrow keys. The interface was DOS-based, simple and rugged. I pulled up the Environmental tab. Air filtration, online. Filters at 68%. Water pumps, offline. Pressure fault. Temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, rising. Water. That was next. The pumps were offline. I checked the fault log. Low suction pressure. The reservoir was either empty or the intake was blocked. But first, I needed to secure my perimeter. Now that the power was on, things would change. Electronic locks that had failed open might seal. Doors that were sealed might open. I pulled up the security tab. A map of the facility appeared on the screen.
It was a wireframe schematic, glowing green. It showed 4 levels. Level 1, surface access, quarantine, sealed. Level 2, admin, barracks. Level 3, engineering, you are here. Level 4, archive, research. There were red dots scattered across level 2. Motion sensors or thermal. I watched them. They were stationary. Bodies or dormant infected. Then I saw something that made the blood freeze in my veins despite the rising heat of the room. On level 4, in the deepest part of the facility, a single blue light was blinking. I checked the legend. Blue. Active terminal login. Someone or something was logged into the system on the floor below me. I typed in a command. Question terminal ID. The system processed for a moment, the hard drive in the console grinding audibly. Terminal ID, ArcLab01. User, Dr. A. Kyber. Session duration, 412 days. 412 days. That was impossible. That was before the collapse, before the city fell. A session that long meant one of two things. Either the user had left the terminal running and walked away over a year ago and it had somehow stayed powered on a separate UPS, or the user was still down there. I looked at the blast door on the schematic that separated level 3 from level 4. It was marked locked, biohazard protocol. I had just turned on the power. I had just woken up the house. If anyone was down there, they knew I was here now.
The vibrations of the generator would be felt through the entire structure. I grabbed the radio handset on the console. It was an old internal intercom. I held it to my ear. Just static. The hiss of dead air. I keyed the mic. This is... I paused. Names did not matter. This is maintenance. Anyone on the net? Silence. Then a sharp crackle of interference. Not a voice. A rhythmic clicking. 3 fast clicks. 3 slow clicks. 3 fast clicks. SOS. It was coming from level 4. I put the handset down. I looked at the generator rumbling below, the heart of the machine beating strong and steady. I had fixed the blood flow, but I might have just alerted the cancer. I needed water. I needed to secure the exits, and I needed to figure out what was waiting for me in the archives. I stood up and grabbed my hammer. The feeling of safety I'd had a moment ago evaporated. The lights made me feel exposed. I was no longer a rat hiding in the dark. I was a target standing in a spotlight. I went to the supply locker in the corner of the booth. I broke the tamper seal with my thumb. Inside, I found a pristine facilities map, a set of master keys on a heavy brass ring, and a box of high-voltage fuses. I took them all. I looked at the map. The water treatment plant was on this level, 2 corridors over. If I could get the pumps running, I'd have infinite water.
If I could not, I'd be drinking from the fire suppression system within 2 days. I checked the generator gauges one last time. All green. It would run for 12 hours on the day tank before I needed to transfer more fuel. 12 hours to secure water and investigate the signal. I stepped out of the booth and headed for the stairs. The warmth of the engine hit me as I descended, a wave of heated air that smelled of oil and progress. It felt good on my face. It felt like work. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the exit corridor. I stopped. The door I had entered through, the one leading back to the mezzanine, was closed. I had not closed it. I raised the hammer, my grip tightening on the leather handle until the knuckles turned white. I shone my flashlight at the door handle. It was a lever type. It was in the horizontal position. Latched. I approached it slowly, placing my feet carefully to avoid scraping the concrete. I reached out and tried the handle. Locked. Electronic mag lock. The power coming back on had re-engaged the security protocols. I was locked inside the generator bay. I looked at the keypad next to the door. It was glowing red. Access denied. I swore under my breath. The competence that had got the engine running had also built my cage. I fished the master keys from my pocket. There was a key cylinder under the keypad, a manual override for maintenance. I sorted through the keys. There were 20 of them, all different cuts. I tried the first one. It did not fit. I tried the second. Too big. I was on the 4th key when the intercom speaker on the wall above the door crackled to life. The voice was synthesized, distorted by the degradation of the speakers, but the words were clear. Containment breach detected in Sector D4. Security protocols active. Please remain at your station. A security team has been dispatched to your location. The message repeated. A security team has been dispatched. There was no security team. There were only the dead. But the system did not know that. It had just unlocked the doors for the security team. Somewhere on level 2, the barracks doors were opening. I found the right key. It slid into the cylinder with a smooth, precise, tactile slide. I turned it. The mag lock disengaged with a sharp snap. I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the mezzanine. The corridor lights were on now, bright and unforgiving. And down the hall, near the junction to the admin block, I heard it. Not a shuffle, not a scrape. The heavy, rhythmic tread of boots. Multiple pairs, moving in unison. My stomach dropped. The infected did not march. The infected did not wear boots. I killed my flashlight and crouched behind a stack of crates. I watched the junction. Shadows stretched across the floor. Long, distorted shapes. Then the figures emerged. They were wearing armor,
Black riot gear, scuffed and dirty. Helmets with visors down. They moved with weapons raised, rifles, tight to the shoulder. But there was something wrong with the way they moved. It was too stiff, jerky, like marionettes with tangled strings. The lead figure stopped. It turned its head slowly, scanning the corridor. The visor was cracked. Behind the polycarbonate, there was no face. Just a dark, dried ruin of skin pulled tight over a skull. They were the security team, the original garrison. They had turned while in uniform, while on duty. And for a year, they had stood in the dark, waiting for a command. The system had just given them one. I tightened my grip on the hammer. A hammer against body armor and Kevlar. The math was not in my favor. I needed to move. I needed to get off this level. I looked at the map in my hand. There was a service ladder in the water treatment room that bypassed the main corridors and dropped down to level 4. The archives. It was running toward the unknown to escape the known. I slipped off my boots, tying the laces together and draping them around my neck. Sock-footed, I moved silently across the floor, sticking to the shadows between the light fixtures. I had the power. I had the heat. Now, I just had to survive the rent. I moved along the wall in my socks, the heavy wool dampening the impact of my heels against the linoleum.
My boots were tied around my neck, bouncing softly against my chest, a pendulum counting down the seconds I had left. The corridor was a tunnel of harsh, fluorescent light, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. 50 feet ahead, the squad of armored figures continued their sweep. Their movement was a grotesque parody of tactical discipline. They walked with the stiff-legged gait of rigor mortis fighting against muscle memory. The lead figure, the one with the cracked visor, turned its head mechanically, scanning the empty air where I had been standing moments before. I slipped into the alcove of the water treatment room entrance. The door was a standard hollow metal fire door, not a blast shield. I gripped the handle, turned it slowly, and pushed. The hinges were dry. They gave a low, vibrating complaint that seemed to scream in the silence. Down the hall, the squad stopped. The lead figure's head snapped toward the sound. I did not wait. I shoved the door open, squeezed through, and slammed it shut. I threw the deadbolt, feeling the solid engagement of the steel plunger. It would not hold them forever, not if they had a battering ram or explosives, but it bought me minutes. I was in the water treatment plant. The room was a maze of PVC and galvanized steel piping, dominated by 3 large centrifugal pumps bolted to the floor. The air here was humid, carrying the scent of chlorine tablets and stagnant water.
I did not have time to admire the plumbing. I jammed a heavy steel mop bucket under the door handle, wedging it against the floor to create a friction brace. Then I pulled my boots on, lacing them with trembling fingers. I could not fight or run in socks. The PA system crackled again. Security team to Sector 3 Echo. Containment breach confirmed. The voice was calm, indifferent. It was the voice of a machine killing me by the book. I stood up and assessed the room. My exit, the service ladder to level 4, was across the room, hidden behind a row of chemical tanks. But I could not leave yet. If I went down to level 4 without water, I was just digging a deeper grave. The archives would be a dead end without hydration. I approached the pump skid. The display on the control panel was flashing red. Suction pressure low. Pump 1 lockout. The system was trying to pull from the main reservoir, but the line was airlocked. The pipes were full of air pockets that the impeller could not compress. If the pump ran now, the cavitation would shatter the ceramic seals, and I'd lose the ability to move water forever. I had to prime the line. I traced the suction pipe, a 6-inch iron line coming from the wall. There was a manual bleed valve at the high point of the elbow, designed to vent trapped air. I climbed onto the pump housing, my bad knee flaring with a hot, tearing sensation as I put weight on it. I reached for the bleed valve.
It was a small brass petcock, corroded green with verdigris. I applied pressure with my thumb and forefinger. Frozen. I pulled my adjustable wrench from my belt, clamped it onto the square head of the valve, and pulled. The metal shrieked, a high, piercing sound of friction. The valve turned a quarter rotation, then snapped off. The brass head sheared clean, leaving the stem buried inside the valve body. I cursed through gritted teeth. I looked at the pressure gauge. 0. Outside, the first impact hit the door. It was not a knock. It was the collision of a body thrown with total disregard for self-preservation. The door jumped in the frame. The mop bucket skidded an inch across the wet floor. They were here. I looked back at the broken valve. I needed to open it. I grabbed my screwdriver and my hammer. I placed the tip of the flathead against the sheared stem and tapped it, trying to cut a new groove. Impact. The door frame buckled slightly at the top hinge. I hit the screwdriver harder. A notch appeared in the soft brass. I wedged the tip into the groove and twisted with both hands, putting my shoulder into the turn. A hiss started. Not a snake's warning, but the angry, sputtering escape of pressurized air. It grew louder, a whistle that climbed in pitch until it was painful. I watched the pressure gauge. The needle twitched. 10 psi. 15. The air was venting. Water was filling the void behind it. Impact. The deadbolt screws were stripping. I could hear the wood of the door frame splintering, the sound like cracking bone. The whistle from the valve turned into a wet sputter. Then, a stream of dark, foul-smelling water sprayed out, soaking my chest. Primed. I dropped off the pump, landing hard on my good leg. I scrambled to the control panel and hit the manual override. Pump start. The electric motor engaged. It did not hum. It roared. A 60-horsepower induction motor spinning up to speed. The floor vibrated. The pipes overhead began to sing with the velocity of fluid moving through them. I checked the discharge gauge. 80 psi. Stable. I had water. The facility had blood pressure. Crash! The door gave way. The top hinge failed, tearing out of the drywall. The heavy steel slab twisted, hanging by the bottom hinge, leaving a triangular gap at the top. A black-gloved hand reached through, grabbing the jagged metal of the frame. Then a helmeted head pushed into the gap. The visor was shattered. One eye was gone, replaced by a hollow, dried-out socket. The other eye was milky white, staring blindly at the movement in the room. It was the point man. He did not roar. He just pushed, his body armor scraping against the door frame with the sound of a car crash in slow motion. He forced his way through, stumbling as the door finally ripped off the bottom hinge and clattered to the floor. 2 more were behind him. They carried M4 carbines slung across their chests, but they did not raise them. The infection had erased the fine motor skills needed to operate a trigger, but it left the muscle memory of aggression. The point man saw me, or sensed me. He lowered his shoulder and charged. He was slow, encumbered by the heavy tactical vest and the leg guards, but he had the momentum of a freight train. I did not have a gun. I had a hammer and a room full of high-pressure industrial equipment. I scrambled back toward the chemical tanks. My boot slipped on the wet floor, and I went down on one knee.
The point man lunged, his armored fingers swiping the air inches from my face. I rolled to the side, kicking out at his knee. My boot connected with the hard plastic of his shin guard. It did not break the bone, but it disrupted his balance. He crashed into the control panel, his momentum carrying him into the steel cabinet. I was up. I swung the hammer. I aimed not for the helmet, but for the neck, the gap between the helmet rim and the Kevlar vest. The claw of the hammer hooked the rubberized seal of the gorget. I pulled back with everything I had. The point man flailed, his arms thrashing. The hammer tore through the rubber and sank into the desiccated flesh of his throat. He did not bleed. He just leaked a thick, black paste. I tried to yank the hammer free, but the curve of the claw was snagged on the collarbone or the armor strap.
The second soldier was through the door. This one was bigger, wearing the heavy padding of a breacher. He stepped over the fallen door and marched toward me, arms outstretched. I let go of the hammer. I backed up, putting the pump skid between me and the breacher. The noise of the motor was deafening now, a constant industrial scream. I looked at the discharge piping. There was a fire hose connection point on the main header, a 2.5-inch valve with a brass cap. The breacher was coming around the skid. He moved with a terrifying, silent focus. I grabbed the brass cap with my pipe wrench. It spun off, clattering to the floor. I gripped the valve wheel. "Thirsty?" I yelled, though he could not understand me. I spun the wheel to the left. The pressure in the line was 80 psi. When I opened that valve, the water did not flow. It exploded. A solid column of water, brown with rust and moving at 60 miles an hour, erupted from the open pipe. It hit the breacher square in the chest. The physics were undeniable. The force of the water acted like a physical battering ram. The breacher was lifted off his feet. He flew backward, his arms windmilling, and slammed into the third soldier who was just entering the room. They went down in a tangle of limbs and wet Kevlar. The water jet continued to hammer them, pinning them against the far wall. The spray filled the room with a blinding mist. I did not stay to watch them drown. I turned and ran for the chemical tanks. The service ladder was there, a narrow, dark hole in the floor with a heavy grate cover. I grabbed the grate and heaved. It was heavy, cast iron, but adrenaline made it feel like aluminum. I threw it aside. The shaft below was pitch black. I grabbed the sides of the opening and swung my legs into the void. My bad knee scraped against the concrete lip, sending a bolt of white-hot agony up my thigh. I gritted my teeth and found the first rung. Above me, the breacher was trying to stand up against the torrent of water. The point man, still pinned by my hammer, was twitching on the floor. I slid down the ladder, ignoring the rungs, letting the sides of the rails burn my palms through my gloves. I dropped 10 feet. 20. The noise of the water pump faded, replaced by the echo of my own breathing. I reached a landing, a steel platform suspended in the dark. There was a hatch here, a wheel lock mechanism similar to the one in the airlock. I spun it. It opened. I tumbled through onto a metal grate floor and spun around, slamming the hatch shut and spinning the locking wheel until it would not turn anymore. I collapsed on the grating, gasping for air. The room was silent. I checked my belt. My hammer was gone, left in the throat of a dead man 3 floors up. I felt a hollow sensation in my stomach. That tool had been an extension of my hand for 5 weeks. Losing it felt like an amputation. I still had my screwdrivers, my wrench, my knife. But the hammer was the equalizer. I sat up and shone my light around. I was on level 4, the archives. The architecture here was different. The industrial utility of the upper levels was gone, replaced by something more refined,
more secretive. The walls were paneled in dark wood veneer that was peeling with humidity. The floor was carpeted, now a sodden, moldy mess. And it was cold. Freezing. The heat from the generator had not reached this deep yet. I stood up, testing my knee. It was stiff, swollen, but it held my weight. I was in a lobby. A reception desk sat in the center, dusty and abandoned. Behind it, a set of double doors led into the darkness. And there, on the reception desk, a small green light was blinking. It was a Toughbook laptop, open and running. I walked over to it, my socks squelching on the wet carpet. The screen displayed a chat window. A single cursor was blinking at the bottom. User, ArcLab01. You made it. User, ArcLab01. The water pressure just spiked. Good work. User, ArcLab01. Did you bring a weapon? I stared at the screen. The text was fresh. I typed back. Who is this? The response was immediate. User, ArcLab01. Of the guy who locked the door. Come to Lab 3. Do not touch the samples. I looked at the double doors. Above them, a faded sign read, Biological Research and Containment. I had come down here for answers.
I had come for the signal. But the voice on the screen was not asking for rescue. It was giving orders. I checked my pack. I had water, if I could find a tap. I had food. I had no hammer. I typed one last question. Are you infected? The cursor blinked for a long time. 10 seconds. 20. Then the text appeared. User, ArcLab01. Define infected. The lights in the lobby flickered, then stabilized. The generator was settling into its load. The facility was fully alive now. I closed the laptop and put it in my bag. I drew my pipe wrench. It was heavy, awkward, a poor substitute for the balance of the S-wing. But it was heavy iron. I pushed through the double doors. The corridor beyond was lined with glass windows looking into laboratories. Most were dark. Some had shattered glass. Inside one, I saw cages. Small ones. Rat cages. All empty. At the end of the hall, a single door stood open, spilling yellow light into the corridor. I walked toward it. The smell here was different. No rot, no ozone. It smelled of antiseptic and yeast, like bread dough rising. I reached the door to Lab 3 and looked inside. The room was a mess of equipment, cables, and hydroponic trays. In the center, sitting in a wheelchair with his back to me, was a man. He was wearing a white lab coat that was stained with coffee and grease. His hair was long, white, and stringy. He was typing on a terminal tower that had been gutted and rewired with erratic, eggs-exposed circuitry. He did not turn around. "Close the door," he said. His voice was raspy, unused. "And do not step on the mycelium." I looked down. The floor was not carpeted. It was covered in a thick, white web of fungal growth. It radiated from the corners of the room, pulsating gently in time with the hum of the servers. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping the wrench raised. He spun the wheelchair around. Dr. Kyber did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who had been eaten from the inside out and somehow survived the digestion. His skin was translucent, veins showing black underneath. His eyes were entirely black, no whites, no irises, just void. But he was smiling. "I'm the control group," he said. He tapped the armrest of his chair. "And you," he pointed a trembling, blackened finger at me. "You're the mechanic. Finally. I broke the centrifuge 3 months ago, and the noise is driving me insane." I lowered the wrench slightly. "You're infected," I said. "Symbiotic," he corrected. "The virus kills the host. The fungus preserves it. It's a delicate balance, one that requires maintenance." He rolled toward a large, glass-walled isolation chamber against the far wall. Inside, something large was moving in the shadows. Something that looked like a man, but with too many limbs. "The security team upstairs?" Keeper asked. "They were the failed experiments. Too much aggression, not enough preservation. But this one..." He tapped the glass. The thing inside hissed, a sound like steam escaping a boiler. "This is the prototype. And it's hungry." Keeper looked at me, his black eyes unblinking. "I need you to fix the feeding mechanism. The hydraulics are jammed. If you do not, it breaks the glass. If it breaks the glass, we both die. And I have so much work left to do." I looked at the creature. I looked at the fragile glass. I looked at the wrench in my hand. I was not a soldier. I was not a scientist. I was a tech. "Show me the hydraulic schematic," I said. Keeper grinned, his teeth stained dark. "Excellent," he whispered. "Welcome to the night shift." The hydraulic cylinder governing the feed chute was a Parker Hannifin industrial model, rated for 3,000 psi. It was jammed in the half-open position, a rigid steel arm refusing to retract. Through the polycarbonate glass of the isolation cell, the creature, the prototype, watched me. It did not pace. It did not throw itself against the walls. It stood perfectly still, its elongated limbs folded against its torso like a praying mantis. The skin was a mottled gray, shifting in texture as it breathed, mimicking the fungal mats that covered the laboratory floor. It had no eyes that I could see, just a series of sensory pits along the ridge where a nose should have been.
"The seal is blown," I said, my voice sounding flat in the sterile air of the lab. "The fluid bypassed the piston head. It's hydrolocked." Dr. Kyber spun his wheelchair slightly, the rubber tires squeaking on the linoleum. "Then bleeded. Bypassed the check valve. The specimen requires biomass. It has been 3 weeks since the last delivery." I looked at the feed chute. It was a stainless steel drawer mechanism designed to slide into the cell, dump its contents, and retract. To fix it, I had to open the service panel on the inside of the safety cage. I would be separated from the prototype by only the inner mesh, a grid of steel wire that looked distressingly thin. I gripped my pipe wrench. My hands were steady. Fear was a variable I had factored out of the equation hours ago. This was just plumbing. High stakes. Lethal plumbing. "I need to cut the pressure," I said. "If I crack the line while it's energized, the jet will slice my hand off." I moved to the hydraulic power unit in the corner. I killed the pump motor. The drone of the machine died, leaving only the wet, rasping breath of the creature and the hum of Kyber's computer. I watched the pressure gauge needle drift down. 2,000. 1,000. 0. I stepped into the service cage. The smell hit me instantly, a concentrated stench of ammonia and rising dough. The prototype shifted. A low vibration shuddered through the floor plates, a growl that was felt rather than heard. I knelt by the cylinder. The fitting was covered in hydraulic oil, slippery and warm. I fit the wrench to the bleed nipple. "Do not startle it," Kyber whispered from the control desk. "It senses cortisol. If you panic, it strikes." "I'm not panicking," I muttered. "I'm working." I turned the wrench. A stream of hot red fluid dribbled out into the catch pan I'd placed underneath. The cylinder groaned, the pressure equalizing. I used a pry bar to force the piston back, clearing the jam. Metal scraped against metal, a vibration that set my teeth on edge. The prototype lunged. It covered the 20 feet of the cell in a blur of motion that the human eye could not track. It slammed into the inner mesh inches from my face. The steel wire bowed inward. The creature's claws, long, serrated spurs of bone, hooked through the gaps, snapping at the air. I did not flinch. I could not. If I pulled back, I dropped the wrench into the mechanism. I finished tightening the seal. "Retract confirmed," I said, my voice barely audible. I backed out of the cage and locked the access door. I walked to the control panel and hit the cycle button. The hydraulic ram fired, smooth and silent. The feed drawer slid in, dumped the tray of nutrient paste Kyber had prepared, and retracted with a solid, mechanical thud. The prototype ignored me now. It crouched over the paste, eating with a wet, slurping efficiency. I wiped the oil from my hands with a rag. I looked at Kyber. "It works," I said. Kyber smiled, his black eyes glistening. "Competence," he said softly. "It is the only currency that matters anymore. Welcome to the team." Time became a fluid concept, measured not in hours but in duty cycles. I did not live in the archives. The air down there was too thick with spores, too heavy with the presence of the thing in the glass. I claimed a room on level 2 in the admin block, just above the generator bay. It was a sterile, windowless box with a cot and a metal desk. I kept it rigorously clean. My life settled into a rhythm defined by the needs of the machine. 0600 hours. Wake up. Check the personal dosimeter Kyber had given me. It measured spore exposure, not radiation. The strip was always a pale yellow, warning but not critical. I washed my face with cold water from the tap, scrubbing until the skin was raw. 0700 hours. The generator bay. I walked the catwalks, listening to the rhythm of the V16 diesel. I checked the oil levels, the coolant temperature, the vibration sensors. The engine was drinking fuel at a steady rate, but the main tank had thousands of gallons left. I cleaned the filters every 3 days, removing the sludge that accumulated from the old fuel. It was a meditative task. Wipe, inspect, replace. 1000 hours. Water treatment. I monitored the pumps. I had found a leak in the discharge header on day 4, a hairline fracture in the cast iron. I did not have a welder, so I repaired it with a sleeve of rubber gasket material and 4 heavy-duty hose clamps, tightened until the screw heads threatened to strip. It held. Every time I walked past it, I ran my hand over the repair, checking for moisture. Dry. Good. 1300 hours. The descent. I took the service ladder down to level 4. I brought supplies, food from the vending machines upstairs, water bottles, batteries. Kyber did not eat much. He injected himself with a slurry he synthesized in the lab, a glowing green liquid that smelled of copper. He claimed it retarded the necrosis of his tissue. I never asked what was in it. I spent my afternoons in the lab, fixing what was broken. I rewired the centrifuge. I calibrated the HVAC dampers to maintain a negative pressure in the containment wing, ensuring the spores did not drift up to the ventilation shafts. That was the bargain. Kyber ran the biology. I ran the physics. We rarely spoke about the world before. It was irrelevant. The world was this box. The walls were concrete, the sky was a ceiling tile, and God was a diesel engine that demanded a sacrifice of fossil fuel. One afternoon, 3 weeks in, I was replacing a ballast in the overhead lights of the lab.
Kyber was typing furiously. His wheelchair connected to the mainframe by a bundle of fiber-optic cables he had spliced directly into his spinal port, some kind of neural interface he had developed before the fall. "The security team," I said, stripping a wire. "The ones on level 3. You control them." It was not a question. Kyber paused. "Control is a strong word. I influence them. The mycelium network extends through the ventilation ducts. It resonates at a specific low frequency. I can suggest directives, protect, patrol, kill. Why did not you stop them from attacking me?" "I needed to see if you were resourceful," Kyber said, not looking up. "A technician who cannot solve a tactical problem cannot solve a structural one." "You passed." I connected the wire. The light fixture flickered and hummed to life, casting a clean white glow over the fungal mats. And if I had not? Then the prototype would have been fed fresh meat instead of nutrient paste. I climbed down the ladder. I looked at the creature in the cell. It had grown. The carapace was thicker, the claws longer. It spent hours staring at me, its head tilting in a mimicry of curiosity. "What is it?" I asked. "Really?" Kyber spun his chair. "It's the next step. Humanity is fragile, mechanic. We freeze, we starve, we break. The symbiosis offers durability. It creates a shell that can survive the vacuum, the cold, the hunger. But the mind usually breaks during the transition. The prototype is the first one to retain problem-solving skills." He pointed at the glass. "Yesterday, it tested the lock mechanism. It did not strike the glass. It tried to dismantle the hinge. It's learning." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Then we should terminate it." "No," Kyber said. "We calibrate the lock." So I did. I reinforced the door with a secondary deadbolt I scavenged from the armory. I welded steel plates over the hinges using a car battery and jumper cables as an arc welder. I built a better cage because that was my job. The crisis, when it came, was not an explosion or a monster breaking loose. It was silence. It was day 58. I woke up at 0600, but the air in my room felt heavy, stagnant. I looked at the vent register on the wall. The ribbon I had tied to the grate, a telltale for airflow, was hanging limp. The ventilation had failed. I grabbed my gear and ran to the corridor. The silence was absolute. No hum of fans, no hiss of air. The generator was still running. I could feel the vibration in the floor, but the lungs of the facility had stopped breathing. I sprinted to the HVAC control room on level 3. The display panel was lit up like a Christmas tree. Fault. Main blower motor overload. Fault. Filter bank A blocked. Fault. Filter bank B blocked. The system had choked. I grabbed my tool bag and headed for the plenum chamber. This was the heart of the air system, a room the size of a gymnasium where the giant intake fans lived. I cracked the door seal. A cloud of white dust puffed out. Spores. I pulled my N95 mask tight, fitting my goggles over my eyes. I stepped inside. The room was a winter landscape. The filter banks, walls of pleated paper 10 feet high, were covered in a thick, fuzzy blanket of white mold.
Kyber's network had grown too fast. It had clogged the intake. The massive blower motor was hot to the touch. The thermal overload switch tripped to save the windings. I could not just clean this. I had to replace the media. But I did not have spare filters of this size. I had to bypass the filtration. If I bypassed the filters, I would restore airflow. But I would also be pumping unfiltered, spore-laden air from level 4 directly into the rest of the facility, and eventually, out the surface vents. I stood there, the heat of the stalled motor radiating against my face. I pulled out my radio. Kyber, the filters are dead. The system is choked. Bypass them. Kyber's voice crackled. It sounded weaker than usual. The CO2 levels on level 4 are rising. The prototype is becoming agitated. It needs oxygen. If I bypass, I contaminate the whole facility. I contaminate the surface exhaust. The surface is already dead, mechanic. What difference does a few spores make?
We are the only thing that matters. The system must survive. I looked at the wall of white fuzz. It was beautiful in a sickening way. Complex, intricate. I thought about the surface, the empty city, the silence, the siren looping on the dead frequency. I thought about the generator, the pumps, the lights. This place was a machine that worked. It was the only thing in the world that still made sense. I walked to the bypass dampers. They were large steel louvers, rusted shut. I took out my hammer, the new one I had found in the maintenance shop, a heavy sledge. I struck the locking pin. Impact. The vibration traveled up my arms. Impact. The pin sheared. I grabbed the lever and threw his weight against it. The louvers groaned, the rust grinding, and slammed open. The air pressure equalized with a rush. I went to the motor control center and reset the breaker. The giant fan spun up. Dust and spores filled the air, a blizzard of biological data. The system roared back to life, sucking the white cloud into the ducts, pushing it into the barracks, the admin blocks, the armory, and up the exhaust shaft, to the city above. I stood in the swirling cloud, watching the pressure gauge stabilize. Airflow, 100%. I had fixed it. I went down to level 4 that evening. The air down there was clearer now, the stagnant CO2 flushed out. Kyber was sitting in his chair, watching the prototype. The creature was calm. It was standing at the glass, its hand pressed against the pane.
Kyber looked at me. He looked different. The veins in his neck were thicker, pulsing with a slow, dark rhythm. Patches of white fuzz were growing on the collar of his lab coat. "You did well," he said. "I contaminated the facility," I replied. "It's only a matter of time before I breathe enough of it to turn." Kyber shook his head. "You won't not turn. You're necessary. The symbiosis preserves what is useful. You are the hands. I am the mind. The prototype is the sword." He handed me a clipboard. "The generator fuel transfer pump is vibrating. The bearings are starting to go. I need you to repack them tomorrow." I took the clipboard. I looked at the list of tasks. 1. Repack fuel pump bearings. 2. Calibrate centrifuge. 3. Reinforce isolation cell glazing. Again. It was a list of chores. It was a purpose. I walked over to the isolation cell. The prototype looked at me. For the first time, I did not see a monster. I saw a system component, A biological hydraulic ram. A weapon waiting for a trigger. I put my hand against the glass, matching the spot where the creature's claw rested. The glass was cold. I turned back to Kyber. "I'll need to machine a new race for the bearings," I said. "The lathe in the workshop needs oil." "Then oil it," Kyber said. I nodded. I turned and walked out of the lab, back to the elevator.
I stopped at the control room on level 3 before going to bed. I sat at the main console and looked at the surface cameras. The screen showed the street above. It was night. The wind was blowing debris across the cracked asphalt. And there, drifting from the hidden exhaust vent in the alley, was a faint plume of white dust. It swirled in the wind, carrying the spores out into the ruins, settling on the dead cars, the empty buildings, the silent bodies. I watched it for a long time. Then I reached out and toggled the radio switch. The loop I had recorded days ago was still playing on the shortwave frequency. This place is still sealed. I'm still alive. If you're out there, come here for truth. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the delete button. If people came, they would bring chaos. They would bring variables. They would break the machine. But the machine needed parts. It needed biomass. I left the message running. I stood up and turned off the monitor. The hum of the facility was a comfort. The air was moving. The water was flowing. The lights were on. I had work to do in the morning.